There are some negatives of big tech though that people don't really think about, and I really wish people would think about before they join the jobs. There's a lot of admin work. There's a lot of meetings. You don't really necessarily grow in the same way that you potentially could if you work for a smaller company and you do more and you deal with less meetings and less stuff like that. Because, you know, in your resume, you're not like, oh, I sat through 40 hours of meetings this week for 3 years or whatever. It's like, someone's like, well, I don't know if that's really transferable. I definitely know a lot of people that sit through meetings most of their days and they don't actually do what they were trained to do or want to do necessarily.
So Michael, welcome back to the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast. This is your second appearance.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm stoked to have you on. Obviously, last time we talked about you, recording videos in a closet under a sheet. We had some really fun things. I see you've kind of moved up in the world and are beyond that now. But it's awesome that you're actually here in Hawaii, kind of visiting around.
Yeah, it's been great. Yeah, and honestly, for people that record things in closets or do some questionable things, like that questionable content really doesn't go away. Sometimes you have to do things that are a bit shoddy or not perfect to get to where you want to go. Yeah,
well, I think at a broad level, it's something that's really, really important. I mean, I look back at some of the early content that I made, and I'm like, wow, that's bad. But the beauty is, I can go back and remake it, and I already know if the video or something did well. How could it not do well if I actually improved the quality of it and made it, past some small threshold or like some like minimum viable threshold that's out there. So, you're just creating future opportunities for yourself in all reality.
Yeah, definitely. Like you can't get possibly worse.
Exactly. So what are you doing in Hawaii?
So I've been traveling for the past 6 months, roughly. I had a lease end in like July 31st of 2022, and I just didn't want to renew the lease with my partner, and so we've been traveling. So it's been good.
Nice. How did you decide to just pick up and travel? I mean, you mentioned some absurd list of places that you've been. Like, I think it was like 10 places or something, probably more than that. But
sure.
How did you decide to just like, we're going to travel a bunch?
Yeah. So for context, I've been a data scientist or content creator, whatever, for a while. My partner is a data scientist as well. And so she's able to work remote as well. And we don't know how much longer it'll actually last as far as the remote work ability, because companies are having layoffs. People are trying to get people back to the office. And we also just weren't happy with where we were living just in our little neighborhood. Like we like Seattle, we like Kirkland, Washington, but we didn't actually like our buildings per se. And we're like, we'll do a month and we'll just travel around and we'll sign a lease. And it's been 6 months so far, and it's not going to end anytime soon.
That's awesome. Was there anything that surprised you about the travel?
I think we don't need as much stuff as we think we do, I guess. Like, yeah, you need a couch maybe. You might, think you need a TV or, laptop or whatever. But some of the other stuff, you really don't need that many things to live and survive and to be happy. And I think that's probably something you've also probably figured out in your travels as well.
Yeah. I find, you mentioned a couch, right?
Yeah.
Like there can be something special about like, I love this couch. It's so comfortable. There's one my old roommate had in Chicago it was one of the best couches I've ever been on. But for the most part, like a couch is a couch. Like I can buy a new couch. I can do whatever it is wherever I would travel to. Or if I'm renting a place that's fully furnished, their couch is going to do the job, right?
Yeah, most likely. Depends how sketchy you stay.
Yeah. That is true. And so like how sketchy have you been staying? Like how have you found the like economic difference of living and staying in one place versus jumping around?
So for context, in Seattle, like renting a place, like 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, depending where you are, could be like $3,000. I mean, depending, a little bit cheaper, a little bit more expensive, could be $2,000, could be, more depending on the area. But for Airbnb, we've been staying like for like $8 a night, sometimes $70. I mean, sometimes there's fees and stuff. If we book for long-term stays, it's not too bad. And of course, with some of these numbers, often my fiance books a lot of this stuff. So my numbers might be a little bit off, one way or the other. But it's honestly, sometimes cheaper. We've actually done the calculation. It's about $200 cheaper than what we're paying for rent in Seattle.
Oh, that's really good.
And keep in mind also that this doesn't include like internet, doesn't include water, like utilities, maintenance. We've just been living in places, not actually, paying for the other stuff. So it's been cheaper than that even.
Well, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of just unseen costs that go into our lives we don't even think about. It's like, oh, if you have a car, you have to pay car insurance, right? When I was in Chicago, I didn't have a car, so I didn't have any of those costs, and it was a little bit more affordable. If you do have to pay for utilities, you have to pay for groceries, you have to pay for these types of things, and I'm sure you've seen like food in different places is like dramatically less or more expensive depending, just like a normal like sandwich or something. It can vary so much
depending on the area, because we've been staying in Waikiki, for example, and food there is really expensive compared to other parts of the island. And whereas when we went to Costco to get food for our Airbnb, which is like a money hack, I guess, it's a lot cheaper. We've been eating pretty cheap. Yeah.
Well, you'd be surprised. So food at the farmer's market is very cost effective in Hawaii. So Hawaii has some weird regulations around shipping. So everything that is shipped to Hawaii, I hope this is not fake news, but has to be shipped to the mainland first and then come here. Oh. So you have an extra step that adds extra cost to any goods that are imported. And so if you go to the farmer's market, most of the stuff is grown locally and you don't have to deal with that overhead price. So you get, in theory, higher quality, locally grown produce for about the same price, possibly even cheaper. And, I really have enjoyed eating that way. And my body feels a little bit better when I do as well. So there's another little hack if you stay around long enough.
Yeah, I'll check it out. I'll be back in Hawaii probably in a couple months as well.
Well, there's one Saturday mornings near town.
Okay.
So you could probably sneak out.
We'll check it out. Assuming the weather's okay-ish.
That's TBD. So you also went through a little bit of a job change. I'm interested in if you could sort of dive into a bit more of what transpired at Intel.
So it's no surprise that there's been a lot of talk of layoffs, cost cutting, and a lot of those sort of things. So I started Intel not long ago. I started in, I think, January 2022, maybe a little bit earlier. And so I joined because I wanted a little bit of stability. I wanted the better health insurance and the better benefits. And I liked what my team was doing at Intel, because you join a company for the whole package, so to speak. And over time, Intel stock, first of all, just started plummeting. And it's supposed to be a safe, consistent company that, you don't have the upside necessarily, but you're not supposed to have the downside as much. So I was working there for a while, and they started talking in the news about Intel's not doing very well. They might have layoffs eventually, or they might, do this sort of stuff. And people at Intel were like, no, all good, everyone, 100%. We got you. There's gonna be no cost cutting. There's gonna be none of this necessarily. And then slowly over time, the message just started changing. And I didn't want to stick around and have my life kind of determined by, someone changed their mind all of a sudden, because it was very clear that things had to change at Intel for money saving reasons, cost reasons. So I decided to put myself out there a little bit, because they announced in the news that they want to get rid of a lot of marketing staff. And a lot of DevRel is actually, in most companies, under marketing. Even if you're doing technical content, or you're making blogs or videos, or helping out with a bunch of different stuff, you're still in marketing. And that's where a lot of cuts were going to come. So I put myself out there, and I got another job, of course. But I didn't want to wait till layoffs and then also be stuck with everyone else that was looking for a job. I wanted to kind of leave beforehand. Having said that, though, I would have been okay getting laid off with severance, because that's an equation a lot of people have to think about. Do you stay long enough where you get laid off with severance, and then you might have a hard time looking for a job? Or do you kind of beat the market in some ways and sometimes find a job before you get laid off, I guess?
So I'm interested Yeah, obviously you said there were some signals outside.
Yeah.
There was the stock price and those types of things. Are there some things that you can see internally that, writing's on the wall, these types of things are going to happen? I think it's very specific to tech right now, these layoffs. I mean, I saw some stat, again, people fact checked me, but essentially the like overall employment market is really good right now. Like there are no other sectors really outside of tech that are seeing mass layoffs like they are now. And I'm interested in, like, if the overall market is all right, but the tech sector is hit so hard, like what specifically is going on there? Is that a leading indicator of the rest of the job market, or is that something like, that is like very specific to what's happening in more of like a tech focused industry?
So I'm not an economist, and having said that, let's speculate. So
it's not financial advice.
And even then, people on a lot of financial channels, they get things wrong all the time.
Yeah.
But I think tech grew so much during the pandemic. A lot of pent up demand. A lot of people bought laptops, for example, because they need computers for their kids. And a lot of people kind of pushed those costs forward, I guess, during the pandemic. And so now a lot of people already have laptops that they'll keep for many, many years. For ads, that people aren't getting as much, clicks, and people are spending less on like
less
marketing
time
budgets.
Online too.
Yeah, less time online, then obviously people get less money for ads. I'm sure people see this in like YouTube, like content creation. AdSense is going down probably. I'm just guessing.
Yes, it is.
Like I heard that from a lot of like financial YouTubers as well, that things are going downward. So I think in general that this is also going to kind of spread, because if people are getting laid off, that means they're buying less stuff. And then one thing I want to speculate about a little bit even more is how are unemployment numbers calculated? So for example, for tech, if people are getting severance, are they actually counted on like employment numbers? Are they counted as the 3% or 4% or whatever the unemployment rate is currently? Or do they have to wait until their severance runs out? If you get 6 months of severance or 3 months of severance or a month, well, you're not really counted as unemployed in some circles, potentially. So there's that. And I can even go even further about sometimes tech leads kind of the market. So it might be an indicator of future pain, because people have more debt than they have had in a while. They student loans haven't been paid in a long time. Maybe they're coming back. Who knows? At least in the US market, there's a lot of potential problems out there that we'll see. So,
yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think you're 100% right. In most things, tech does actually lead the market. They're on the cutting edge of a lot of things. We look at all the technologies and those types of things out there. What's to say they're not on the cutting edge of understanding what's happening with the broader economy, or what they're seeing, or what they're projecting, what their forecasting is telling them. I still don't think in any sense it's a good thing that they're laying off all these people, because those people have, bills to pay, families, $2 million mortgages on houses, whatever it might be. But I think that everyone should be prepared and understand that, okay, things with the economy, things with future prospects, they could go south. I mean, in any scenario, like if you're looking at like a bunch of different kind of simulated outcomes, there's bad outcomes, there's good outcomes, there's some form of distribution. And I like think about this a lot. I try to hedge as much as possible for the different outcomes, opportunity sets. I mean, I have like a normal job, but I also have worked really hard to diversify my income. I know you have as well. I'm interested, what are the best things that people can do if, let's say, there is like not an impending disaster, but like some impending type of downturn that is hypothetically projected by these tech companies? Like, what should should the student do, or the entry-level data scientist, or someone who's earlier in their career?
Well, people in general, and this is a personal philosophy, should try to cut their costs as much as possible. One way to hedge your bet is to not have as much cost you have to deal with potentially. So during the pandemic, I was not working a full-time job. I was making courses and stuff, thinking I can get another full-time job when it came up. And I waited a little bit, and the pandemic happened. No one was hiring and other stuff. But I think for a lot of like entry-level data scientists and people in general, is to make yourself, like in general, more presentable for employers, to potentially have side incomes, side hustles. So for some people, that could be making a little money with blogs on the side. It could be YouTubing. It could be consulting. Could be making courses. It could be a lot of different things that you can utilize your skill sets. And even some fields that are kind of a bit divergent from data science. Like recently, actually, I shouldn't say that in a podcast, but essentially, occasionally I get people reaching out for some of my mechanical engineering skills from like way back in the day. So really just have ability to diversify incomes, especially if you have to, because the time to look for a side income or look for more money is not always the time to do it. It's to do it, months ahead of time or years ahead of time, ideally, which sounds crazy.
Well, that's a really good point you made about diversifying, even beyond just like different income streams, diversifying in terms of completely different skill sets. That's something that has been on my list to do. Like I've been wanting to start doing some real estate investing and those types of things, but I just, that does require a lot of startup capital and some other things. But, my current work in data science and my content and the podcast, they're all like sort of in a similar segment. And if one of those goes south, it's not that they'll all go south, but they'll probably be pulled in a similar direction. They're like highly correlated assets in some sense. I think it would probably be helpful if I had some completely uncorrelated assets. And, I have investments in the stock market and those types of things. But that is an interesting perspective. I'm usually of the belief that you sort of should be bundling and highly correlating your assets, because if they grow really quickly together and they compound and you get lessons learned all together. But I think that there's definitely an argument to be made that, I should at least have something from a pure financial perspective that is not directly related to all the other stuff that I do.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, for some things, there's a high startup cost, like you said, with real estate. But for some things, not necessarily. For a lot of people, it could be just driving Uber. It could be making art or selling art online. It could be a lot of different things that people can make money from. It could be teaching a class. Some people, like you, do a lot of martial arts. You could be teaching that. Like, yes, maybe it's not as potentially high upside income wise, but first of all, you get a good workout in, you connect to the community, get to know people, but it's a way to hedge your bets in some ways, I guess.
This episode is brought to you by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z4 workstation. I really love that Z workstations can come standard with Linux, and they can be configured with the data science software stack. With the software stack, you can get right to work doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show.
I've always loved the idea of so I'll probably get criticized for this, but I am a big believer, like, you should monetize your hobbies.
Yeah.
Like, just because you're getting paid to do something doesn't mean you're a professional at it, right? And it can be nice to say, I look at this podcast, like, I do it for fun. This is like super enjoyable for me. I get to meet new people. I get to like test my perspective, all this stuff. But I can also monetize it, right? I turn on AdSense. It's like a click of a button. Granted, I make like $50 a month on AdSense in the podcast, but I can take on sponsors. I can do those types of things. And it's like, why, just because I have those sponsors, it doesn't change the podcast. Yeah. I will say, when I was playing golf and I started to get to compete and try to do that completely changed the dynamic. Yeah. But there are a lot of things that are like, this is a lot lower stress than trying to play professional golf. Let's put it that way. Right. And the sponsors, they just want to get their name out there. They want people familiar with the product. And that's low stakes. Like you can get paid for things in a low stakes manner, which is, I think, the shorter version of what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of my blogging is something I've monetized even accidentally in some ways. Like, some platforms like, oh, you have to put it behind a paywall or something if you publish here, or, hey, we want an article from you. And I'm like, okay, sure. Like, that sounds great. I do it in my spare time for free anyway, but you're going to pay me. Sure. Like, let's do that. And in some regards, I've monetized my blogging ability. The one thing about blogging that it's not always easy if you want to monetize your hobby thing, if someone wants you to ghostwrite, well, that can take away from your hobby in some ways, because you have to talk like someone else, or you have to not have your name on something, and that could be part of your portfolio or your ability to get future employment elsewhere in the future. So
yeah, well, I like a lot of the systems they have out there now. I like Medium. I think YouTube has a decent payment system. The podcasts are lagging a little bit on that front, but there's a really neat just economy that's created that's essentially win-win for everyone, right? You know, the consumer has to pay a little bit in terms of seeing ads or listening to an ad read. But what you get in return is so much great. I mean, you get all this free information. And generally, I probably shouldn't say this, but you can just like skip the ads, right? Like you hear it, it's like, oh, I do this whenever I listen to like the big podcasters. Is all like, okay, like go exactly 2 minutes, and then it's picking up where it was before. And to me, like, you know, the people that are putting content out there, like they should get something for that if it's creating value for people or value for sponsors or whatever it is. But that is still at virtually no cost to the individual consumer. And I think it's amazing we can live in a world where you are creating that like a win-win environment. That's one of the few things I think big tech companies have done really, really well, is they've made it so that it's like as, you know, like as non-intrusive as possible while giving proper incentives to everyone in the system. Like the creators, although I don't think it should ever be like purely financially motivated, they do have like a financial incentive to produce good things and to produce them more. And the consumers still have the incentive to listen because they're getting good value out of what's being said, and it's not like completely overrun with ads. Yeah,
for the most part. I mean, sometimes people try to get a little bit cash grabby, I'd say, in like for ads.
So YouTube automatically puts the ad placements in the podcast
these days, yeah.
And like one of them, I don't know what happened. It put in like 40 ads. Like it like does it natural pauses or whatever, and like the most I've ever seen is like 3 or 4, maybe 5 ads in a podcast episode I do. And it was like every 2 minutes. And I had to go back in and like manually remove them. And I was like, oh, I felt so bad because like people were commenting like, it would be great if there weren't so many ads in this one. And I was like, oh,
you're like, I'm not getting cash grabby. Like I have no choice in this.
Well, the sad thing is I think for putting that many ads in, like I might have made like 30 cents more.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, it's not worth it to me to create that bad will, right?
It's a negative incentive right there.
Yeah. You know, but at the end of the day, like that is one of the flaws in automation in some sense, is that like they can break down, they can not be great. But I think overall it's still like a pretty net positive system.
It's definitely been good. I mean, some platforms, for example, I think YouTube used to allow you to like turn off ads on your videos. At least back when I had YouTube stuff. I still do kind of, but I used to be able to turn off ads. And then a couple years ago, they're like, no, we have to have ads on all videos, no matter what. It's up to the creator if they want to make money from it.
Yeah. So that's actually when I turned on ads for the podcast. Is that I was like, well, if YouTube's gonna put them in anyway, I should get the revenue from that. You know, if the consumers are still going to get sort of like dinged in that way, you know, and also that sort of looks better for the creators as well, is that like, okay, YouTube's going to take it, you're going to see it anyway. I think almost everyone would universally rather have the creator actually get some of that income than YouTube get that income, or get all of that income. So, you know, that does question YouTube's incentive system then, is that, okay, if the creator is getting all of it, like, is YouTube happy about that? But I mean, I would imagine they're still getting,
they're doing well.
Yeah. They're not hurting. They're one of the, not few companies, but they're not hurting for cash.
No, if they're hurting for cash, they're probably not using it too well. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I would argue. Well, Google still let go of a bunch of people, but I guess that's, I would imagine they fired very few YouTube team members.
Yeah, it could also be that people have they've massively increased their hiring the last couple of years. They're just trying to get back to normal level. And they've also gone the ability to do layoffs without getting massive negative repercussions from outside people. And also they're trying to change the game a little bit with their employees. Hey, be more serious about job maybe, or trying to instill a little fear maybe. it's all speculation, but clearly some layoffs in some companies, they didn't really have to do them, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it was essentially all of the big tech companies, I think, except for maybe Apple, which I think is not a bad thing in this. I mean, so first, I think it's bad that everything was, that all these people were laid off. But I think it's not a bad thing in the sense that it sort of shatters this idea that big tech is this like holy grail. It's this thing that is like it's the complete number one aspiration of all these people. I think that there's so many good jobs, so many like important roles and like good data roles that are not in like pure big tech companies and the like manga companies, that those should be getting more awareness. It's like, okay, you know, like I could work in something that is like meaningful to me, like helpful to the world, and also like a good job that is not in any of those things. I think I don't think I can argue that like that Meta is like a net good for the world at this point, right? But still, people really want to work there because it's prestige, it's money, it's a lot of these things, and I think that is fracturing a little bit.
Yeah, and for a lot of these companies as well, sometimes they might lower benefits. For big tech, I don't think they have done that so far, but a lot of people also work for tech companies because the benefits are great, or fertility like benefits, the health insurance. You can go to see a doctor a lot easier at big companies because you're on a big insurance plan. There are some negatives of big tech, though, that people don't really think about, and I really wish people would think about before they join the jobs. There's a lot of admin work. There's a lot of meetings. And
if you hate Jira tickets or
whatever they're using, it's very painful, and you don't really necessarily grow in the same way that you potentially could if you work for a smaller company and you do more and you deal with less meetings and less stuff like that. Because, you know, in your resume, you're not like, oh, I sat through 40 hours of meetings this week, or like for 3 years or whatever. It's like someone's like, well, I don't know if that's really transferable for a lot of places. I definitely know a lot of people that sit through meetings most of their days and they don't actually do what they were trained to do or want to do necessarily.
Yeah. I think, you know, there's a lot of, and I've talked about it probably at length in the past, but the difference between like working at a startup and one of these big companies is impact. So you probably have more total input into the success of the company if you're working in a smaller company, but also like breadth of skills. You know, someone could spend 6 months of their life at a big company A/B testing if you should change the color of a button or something along those lines. Maybe that's like a little bit too granular, but in the scope of things, like how much impact are you really gonna have in the product or the outcome in a company that big? If you're looking at it in like pure millions of dollars, maybe actually a couple million, like more than the amount of money you make. But if you're looking at it as the percent of impact that you have on the company, you're looking at like a 0.01% possible upside. Whereas let's say you save a small company $300,000, that could be
huge,
you know, like 20% of the impact on the entire company bottom line, which is pretty cool.
And honestly, 6 months seems a little bit like short for changing a small thing in some cases, because a lot of companies, you don't want to, you know, wreck the golden goose or wreck the product that, you know, gives people livelihoods and helps people or whatever. So yeah, being small is sometimes a really good thing. I would argue for a lot of people though, that working for a big company early in careers, at least what I've seen, has been very beneficial, because it's kind of like building a brand. Like, hey, I'm X, you know, Google, X Microsoft, X Meta. I mean, I'm assuming you think Meta is a great thing, but and then working for smaller companies afterward, because people are more likely to reach out to you. They're like, hey, this person worked at this great place that vetted them. Maybe I want to hire them for whatever reason.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that, it's still like good to have these companies on your resume, especially for future employability. Like, I'm not someone that's gonna poo-poo that by any stretch of the imagination. I think, for better or for worse, I'm quite a realist in future employability. But you really should be prepared and do as much homework as you can to understand what you're getting into. I think that that's a lot more of what I've been focused on recently. You know, it's interesting with content-wise. I wouldn't say I have more of a negative spin on things than I used to, but I think a lot of people go into data, go into technical careers because they think it's something that it's not. Because people are spreading a false narrative about how great it is and all these things. You make all this money, you get all these benefits, whatever it is. And then they do the work and they hate it. And like, I feel like since I have a voice, it's my responsibility to tell people, like, maybe you'll love it. Like, totally fair. But like, do your homework and see if you would like it. Like, you have to like do some introspection. You have to figure this out, or else you might be signing up for a career that, yeah, it pays well, but you like hate yourself every day. Because I've been in those roles. That's how I felt about consulting. You know, consulting pays really well, but I guess I technically still do consulting in some sense, but you know, I'm traveling all around. I'm getting yelled at by my bosses. Like, my work's never good enough. And I was like, wow, like, this is so miserable. Like, why would anyone do this? And I was like, oh, I was that guy that only saw the grass is greener on the other side. Like, I'm a student. I'm not a consultant. Once I'm a consultant, it'll be great. And it just wasn't the case. So,
yeah, there's definitely golden handcuffs for a lot of people. That's how they kind of get in those kind of positions where the pay is really good. The people are generally happy, like, with the pay part, but the lifestyles may not be ideal. Some people have like a rest and invest mentality where they're doing like the bare minimum to get RSUs, not OKRs. I saw someone say that one time. It was hilarious. And like, this is so for the big company, and they're like, RSUs, not OKRs. I'm like, oh my, I can't believe you said that. But then there's also people that are working in these big tech companies, and they think in school, like, oh yeah, like, I'll get a job. Like, my mom, you know, worked at this place. My dad worked at this place, and they worked 40 hours a week, or they worked, you know, X number of hours a week. But for some tech jobs, you're not working 40 hours a week. You can work a lot more. And it's stressful. You can work, you know, during the day, at night, in the morning. And that can be very much of a grind and very much of a potential for burnout, basically.
Yeah. Well, I think the potential for burnout, from what I've heard, it comes not just from the hours you're working, but like the volatility. So for example, if something breaks, like if let's say something breaks after a change you've made, and you got to call at 8 at night, and you're like sweating, trying to like figure it out before, you know, it affects 100,000 customers, which maybe isn't that many in the scheme of things, but like, that is unbelievably stressful.
Yeah.
You know, I have some friends who are working as data engineers, and it's like, oh, you changed something and it broke the entire pipeline, and you have to fix it right now, and it's 2 in the morning. You're like, well. And
then oftentimes you're doing something else. Like, you could be with your family, you could be on a date, and you get those calls, and you're like, why? Like, why? I wasn't even on call today. Like, why am I doing this? Yeah. There's definitely some downsides people just don't talk about. So.
It was something interesting in terms of the golden handcuffs that you were describing. The only surefire way that I've seen people break out of it is through like some form of entrepreneurial venture. I think I've had 4 friends leave Facebook essentially right before the tech layoffs. And it's because they had this side business that they were diving all into, or because they had this other, you know, like opportunity set that was in front of them. And I find that really interesting. You know, you can get trapped in the more traditional work sphere. And I think it's very powerful to be able to have that leverage to do something else, right? Because if you're like, okay, you know, I don't want to do this type of work. I want to move to a different place in the company, whatever it might be. It's very powerful to like know that you can walk away in some sense, or like you can take time to look for other work, or you can invest in this other thing that pays you dividends in your career, rather than being like, oh, if I'm not beholden to the company that I'm working on, like I will have nothing, right? Yeah. To me, that's something that anyone can leverage in a really cool way. It can be scary for people to start something new, but even if you want to go down the original, like a normal traditional career path, I find that there's tremendous value in just having that leverage point so that you can progress your like more traditional career further faster.
Yeah, there's a lot of power in that. And the one thing about like golden handcuffs or any sort of opportunity you have is to really take advantage of the opportunity you have, so you can do something that you want to do more later, or have the option to be able to do something. If you have all your expenses levered up to the golden handcuff level for a lot of people, well, you can't take a pay cut to go work at a startup. You can't your own opportunities or entrepreneurship if you have expenses that meet the golden handcuffs, as crazy as that sounds.
Yeah.
And then not even just from a financial perspective, but also like a lifestyle perspective. Like, are you setting yourself up to be able to do the entrepreneurial activities?
Yeah. Well, there is something to be said about lifestyle creep and, you know, how you actually go about preventing that. I think a lot of people don't realize that if essentially you're making no money, even, you know, like your expenses are meeting your costs, you're poor. Doesn't matter how much money you make. If you don't have any income that you're retaining, if you lose your job, you're broke and you're in debt. And that's unbelievably scary to me.
Yeah, it can happen really fast. And I've definitely seen and heard some of that stuff from some of my friends that got laid off recently. And layoffs, you know, some of them happen quite recently and they're already having some major trouble just because they didn't potentially plan for the worst, which is horrible to say. Like, you want to plan for the worst and hope for the best. But that's a old saying, and it's a good saying for a lot of different reasons. That's one of them. And it's scary. And some people, they really don't have choices about leaving jobs sometimes, or they're set in one area. And I guess before remote work was even harder because you're set in like a specific area that only has this company. You're only in Oregon with this one company, or you're only in somewhere in North Carolina with this one company. It can be rough.
Yeah. Well, there's also constraints on finding new opportunities that a lot of people don't think about.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, just like you said, location can be one. Like, let's say maybe you want a remote job and that's okay. But let's say you really liked working in like some remote place where you used to be. And like, there's 4 companies out there that have roles or potential roles that you'd be a good fit for, even if you're further down the road in your career. That can be really hard to find another job. You have to make some type of personal sacrifice to get another job like that. You might have to wait for someone to get promoted or someone to move or someone to leave in order to fit one of those roles. So, like, you know, depending on how set you are in your life already, your potential job set might actually be a lot smaller than you really think, which can be pretty terrifying for people, I can imagine.
Yeah, and then even for some remote roles, they want you to be in a certain time zone, or we can only pay people in certain geographies for some legal reason or benefit reasons. And it can be very limiting in some ways because you thought you had a lot more options than you actually did.
Yeah.
So.
Well, let's talk a little bit about remote work. I mean, obviously you're working remotely now.
Very remote.
You're also working remotely, you know, essentially 2 months after starting at a new place.
Yeah.
What's that dynamic been like?
It's been an experience. It's been definitely an experience because I started working remote and traveling before I actually left my previous job at Intel. Technically, I was working for a startup within Intel, but that's another story entirely. We can go down at a different time. But it's definitely an experience to find a good work area and to have a good setup that you can move from place to place. And also, if you're traveling somewhere that's a different time zone, being available during normal working hours can be sometimes a challenge.
I imagine this time zone is probably not super easy.
This is not perfect because typically a lot of people I work with are PST. So in Hawaii time, it's
not too bad.
It's 2 hours
PST.
different. But I've had some meetings that were like at 5 a.m. And sometimes people had early meetings for PST time. So for me, it's even earlier. So
you do know it's daylight savings time. Is it this week or next week?
I don't know.
It's soon, but Hawaii doesn't change.
Okay.
So you're going to have to wake up an extra hour early. I hate to break that to you now.
Yeah. So there is that, but I've also worked with people overseas before and been traveling. So sometimes I've had 5 a.m. meetings anyway in the past. So working in the middle of the night, it can be a bit of a challenge sometimes, but with enough coffee, with enough tea, anything's possible.
Understandable.
There's other challenges too. So I'm sure you've experienced some of these.
Yes, most of the people I work with are on East Coast time. Although my boss gets up at like noon every day. So I shouldn't throw him under the bus like that. He gets up at like 11:30 every day.
Wow. So
it works really well. I mean, it works great for me because we wake up around the same time. I'm like a super early bird here time. But for East Coast, I guess I'm a late riser. But I'm on East Coast time next week. jumping around time zones is it's not fun for me, just sleep wise, especially going that direction.
Yeah.
But I really enjoy when I come back, because then at like 6 a.m. easy get up every time.
It's very hard on the body. I think one thing people also forget is, yes, I'm traveling, or you're traveling, or other people are traveling, but a lot of people also have people across the world for meetings. So a lot of people might have, 10 p.m. meetings. Sometimes people might have things that are really, really early because there's an all hands meeting around the globe. So there's challenges like that. But the one thing about remote working and remote traveling is you're doing it to yourself in some ways.
No excuses. Yeah.
So there's really no excuse. So like, oh, I don't want to go to that 5 a.m. meeting. Well, it's not their fault that I've been in Hawaii for a while and working. So I have to go to every 5 a.m. meeting equivalent. So
yeah, and I get a lot of like boohoos. Oh, like, too bad you live in Hawaii. I'm like, oh, you're right. It is pretty nice. Outside of having to wake up early, like, I shouldn't complain. So how's the nature of this work you're doing different than what you were doing before? So, obviously you went from more like technical contributor to DevRel to, I know, like sort of
something
yeah.
else. Yeah. So before Intel, I worked for Anyscale. They're the creators of the RAPE project. And by the way, I'll get to your question. And the RAPE project is actually one of the open source libraries that OpenAI used for ChatGPT to train it, because you can't really train models on a single machine anymore for those like large models. It's just really not practical in any way, sense, or form. So people distribute compute. So they work with multiple nodes, basically like multiple computers, to train things. So I was doing a lot of like blogging for them and helping out with some marketing initiatives, helping out with conferences and stuff like that. And then for a variety of reasons, which I can talk about if you really want to, I decided to join Intel for partially the stability, the health insurance was a little better because I had some health problems that are pretty significant. And then at Intel/Converge, because it was a startup within Intel, although technically I could have been assigned anywhere inside Intel. It's a bit complicated. And sometimes I was. That was very much evangelist and kind of do initiatives, not necessarily the lowest person on the totem pole anymore, I guess. And then I left Intel, as we discussed earlier in this podcast. And then my current job at Parallel Domain is something I was really excited about, because if you're in the DevRel world or if you're in the content space, you want pretty visuals. Like even this podcast, I'm sure will have some thumbnail in some way, shape, or form. So we do synthetic data for perception tasks. So autonomous vehicles, drones, mobile computer vision. And a lot of my role is like talking about like what is synthetic data, like what's it used for, why use synthetic data, could you use synthetic data with real world data, and like how would you do that? And of course, mentioning that like, we have a service where people pay us for data. But it's really been enjoyable because I'm a content lead technically. So I make blogs, and these are things I can share on my own, social media, and my own places, and I get paid for it. And I can share very like simple things. So there's not as many like checks and balances when I release something, which is really nice, because if you work for a big company, you want to release a blog, it can take a long time. It could take a really painfully long time sometimes. I'm not even talking about previous employers. I'm talking about like way back in the day.
No, I've had quite a few people that, we've talked about how, why wouldn't a company want you to just release your own stuff, create your own brand? It looks really good for the company if you're a thought leader in the space. And it's just, maybe some like slight legal risk, but I think the upside is 100% worth it. You have these people that have hundreds of thousands of followers on LinkedIn. They're clearly knowledgeable, and it's like a tagline they have that they work at Amazon or whatever it is. And it seems like smaller companies really get that a lot better. I guess the upside is possibly a little higher. You don't need someone to tell you who Google is or who Amazon is or to like drive traffic there. But I think that's such a shame, is that we're missing out on a lot of like really smart people, providing free information, because a lot of these companies are, essentially silencing them by all this overhead that you have to do.
Yeah. And it's really cool. Like just this morning, I released a LinkedIn post of a car driving down the road, like synthetic, like complete synthetic. Think like Grand Theft Auto, but like way better. Is probably the way to say it without getting too much trouble for my like work. like real simulations with like perfect labels, and I could just release that. I didn't have to like go to my boss and just like talk about it. Like, hey, I'm releasing some video of some of our images, and like there was very little of that. Whereas a lot of employers, like you said, like big places, of course, there's a major downside because they're big companies, but also legally speaking, like big companies, if someone says something like really controversial and like, hey, I represent, big company X, and here, let me tell you about the most controversial takes of the day in, 5 minutes. Like, first of all, you get fired for that. But for smaller companies, it's easier to deal with these sort of issues, I guess, to say.
Well, one of my friends, Alex Freeberg, so right after he quit his job, he started doing these LinkedIn posts of like unethical, like work hacks. I was like, dude, I guess you don't want to work for anyone ever again. I love it. Truly committing, but they were pretty funny. I thought that series was really great, and like he waited. So
were some of those things about like hiring other people to do your job and stuff like that?
Yeah, so, stuff like that. A lot of it was like, I can't remember. I have to go back through his posts, but they're pretty funny.
Yeah, I'll look for them and I'll share them below like the comments of this video.
Heck yeah, I'll try. Yeah, I'll try to link some of those from Alex there. So I actually am very interested in synthetic data. Historically, I would think of it like, like you have tabular data. We've all used like Smote to resample and do those types of things. But I guess in the playing field now is a lot of it image data, is a lot of it like these different format things.
Well, I can only speak about like what I do. I typically deal with image data because let's say for the use case of autonomous vehicles, like there's some things you really don't want to have data for a lot of different reasons.
Crashes and stuff.
Crashes. Like you can't have, someone being run over a million times in different ways, in different environments, different lighting, in different scenarios, in different parts of the world. First of all, that's really unethical. like besides the fact it's really unethical, you can't possibly run over people enough in different ways. And there's a lot of things that they're really hard to simulate. So if you're getting data from a self-driving car right now, in like the Bay Area or Arizona or some places, those are certain geographies. They have a certain distribution of weather. And for a lot of vehicles, you want or autonomous applications, you want some of the weird use cases or the edge cases. You want some of the things that, of course, that you don't have in your data, but sometimes some of the things that you're just kind of curious about or the unknown unknowns, so to speak.
Really cool.
So,
and so what you can, I would imagine you probably can't share everything, but like, how are you using like generative models to create these types of things?
So,
is it?
I think it's a bit of a hybrid approach. And I really trying to see like exactly what I'm about to say, but a lot of it starts with building a world, rendering objects in the world. So it's not necessarily generative. You kind of have a framework for building things on top of. But that makes it like a scaffolding. And of course, I may change my tune a little bit in a couple of months as I work more. But that's kind of the idea is you can add generative things to like data that you're generating. You can have like, let's say you have a circle or like a sphere in your image. You can use that area to generate a soccer ball on top or something. Like you want to have some control over the labels essentially, because it would generate AI. It may not always be clear if they generate the perfect thing. Like how do you QA that if you're generating something, generally speaking?
I gotcha. And so, I mean, it seems like you're almost using something like Unreal Engine or something along those lines where you're able to actually make, what the computer does not know necessarily the difference between a like 3D generated like a game or something compared to a real image of this happening. And for better or for worse, these games are hyper realistic these days.
They're getting realistic-ish, but they're not perfect. I think that's the biggest problem is you also don't want to like add something to a model where the model can clearly tell it's generative or it's synthetic in nature.
Or there's like metadata that is telling you everything.
So sometimes there's different approaches to training models with synthetic data. Sometimes you might pre-train on synthetic data and then fine tune on your real data to kind of get the weird edge cases. So like construction zones or whatever for cars. Well, yeah, you can train 100% of your model with synthetic data of like construction zones, like to pre-train, and then, you know, fine tune it on your real data because you want to, you know, be able to detect construction zones. Like it's a real problem if your model just like drives right through them. But there's a lot of different like machine learning approaches to training with synthetic data. I'm happy to share a link. It's not a simple sort of thing. But then there's also the case of if all your synthetic data is all about the weird edge cases, then your model might recognize something else in the image and be like, oh, this is synthetic. It must be some weird edge case. So there's about, you know, sampling things properly for your synthetic data. Sometimes people do joint training. So sometimes they do like real data plus synthetic at the same time. So there's a lot of different things going on with synthetic data. And that's something I'm kind of learning about as I go, because I'm not an expert in something. I just got into, a couple of months before I joined the company, of course, but something I just started. And that's one thing I think a lot of like data scientists need to, and engineers and just people in general, like need to understand when they get into the industry is you're not going to be an expert day one or day two or month one or month two. You're going to learn as you go.
Interesting. Well, so that's, I think, a pretty important pivot is how do you upskill in a new role, right? You know, you're not at the beginning of your career.
Yeah.
You're kind of mid or like sort of getting into like the more seasoned years of your career. When you're coming in at a relative, like a higher level, how do you pick up things quickly? How do you integrate with a new organization? How do you get all of that information and use it and leverage it effectively?
Not always easily. So we can talk about what you've done over your career to kind of upskill as well. But for me, a lot of it was some of my skills were transferable. So I worked a lot in distributed computing, for example, and to generate some things, you can't necessarily train things on a single computer. It's just not practically feasible in a lot of sense. A lot of models like OpenAI does, for example, they're trained very widely. So that was a skill that was transferable to my current role, essentially, as well as writing about complex things that not a lot of people know about. That was a very good writing skill that was very transferable to my new role. But I think one of the biggest things about like joining a new company and upskilling is talking to people, not just assuming, you know, like, oh, I don't know this, I need to know, you know, X because I think that's what I need to know. So just talk to people about your new company, your new job, or if you're interviewing, find out like what tools they use or what stack they use and like why they do what they do, and kind of upskill from there. Rather than when you're looking for a job just out of school, you're like, I need to know everything. There's a giant tool set of like R, Python, Tableau, Power BI, SQL, NoSQL back in the day, I guess. People don't talk about that too much anymore, but it's more focused, I think, than early in the career, I'd say.
I've found that individual people, so I'm sure you're familiar with like the Pareto principle, right? It's like 80-20 rule. I found that like 20% of the people have 80% of the knowledge, and really identifying and trying to essentially get to know what these people know is unbelievably effective, right? I think it's important to talk and get to know a lot of the team, but there's always going to be a subset of people that know significantly more about how everything fits together and about a bunch of overarching issues than like a lot of the other people combined. And I find that like I've tried to explore who those people are and then like exploit their knowledge, not in like a bad exploit, but like in like a technical,
utilize their knowledge for good purposes.
Precisely. And you know, that's something I've leveraged in my entire career is that like there's some, for example, like programming languages, some specific libraries that I use, some specific methodologies that I use that disproportionately impact the success of everything I do. You know, I've talked to a couple like Kaggle grandmasters recently, and there's a specific subset of algorithms that they use. I mean, mainly it's transformers now that have a disproportionate effect on their outcomes in the competitions. And so it's like, oh, why don't I focus more on these? Obviously not entirely, but you really can be really efficient with your time if you're trying to identify things like that. And just, I haven't in any scenario seen that proven false, that this select minority has a majority of like influence or knowledge or input.
Yeah, that's really true. There's definitely some times when some people don't provide as much value to organizations. And there's some people that provide a massive disproportionate influence in the organization. They know what's going on, why it's going on, why decisions were made back in the past. So like, why'd you choose to use this versus this? Or why we do this versus this? And those sort of like stories, those sort of knowledges, and like why we use this tool, like how this code base works, how they connect the dots for you is very valuable.
Yeah.
So,
well, the funny thing is it's not always who you expect it to be. You're like, oh, the CIO should be that person, right? They should have all this institutional knowledge, all this stuff. And then you're like, oh, they don't
know anything.
Yeah, it could be the case. I've worked with some that were really great, and then some were like, oh, like, like it's like people 3 steps down. It was like, oh, this guy is like just a director of XYZ thing, knows how everything fits together. And it's like, oh, I guess I should be making my time to talk.
That
to
person's
them.
duct tape, really.
Exactly.
Like everything in a lot of places, you think it's like sometimes really structured. In some places it is. But a lot of places, it really is just duct tape and like a small thing holding everything together. Could be one person, could be a certain part of the software, could be something,
Yeah. Well, hopefully they'll be, if they raise that person and celebrate that person, it makes duct tape into like, I don't know, like some form of plaster and then cement over time. But...
And the problem is some of those people aren't always promoted or given raises. Sometimes they're too valuable to promote. I've heard that before from a lot of places. And those people leave, and then everyone's like, scrambling. It's like, what happened? Like, why did we not hit our metrics this quarter? Or like, well, why is everything falling apart? And it's like, oh, that one guy over there, or that one woman, or whatever, they were disproportionately impactful, and we need to hire them back. We need to try to get them back.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing. I think someone not getting promoted when they're integral is like a failing on both the organization and on the individual's part. Right. So if you're so valuable that if you leave, the company will essentially implode in like at least some sense, you should be able to advocate and like have leverage. And if you're not doing that, you might feel like, oh, there isn't this upward mobility, whatever it is. Maybe you could do the same work, but you just ask for significantly more money. Yeah. And like that is a movement forward. Because nobody is going to know how valuable you are in an organization better than your own organization, right? If you're like, well, if I leave, who's going to run this, and this? Give me a title change and give me a promotion. I'll still do the same work. That's okay. I mean, if you don't want to do the same work, that might be a different thing. But at the same time, like, I kind of feel like, yes, organizations should be celebrating you, giving you more pay, whatever it might be, but it's also your responsibility to do that, or to like ask for it. And I've had some friends that are like too stubborn to ask for it or whatever it might be. And I'm like, why?
Just ask. You're doing all the work.
Yeah, you have all of the leverage. Like, what are they going to do? Very few people have ever been fired for asking for more money if they're good at their job and they're creating value for an organization. They might get told no. Yeah. But like,
the no might, equal some conflict maybe. Yeah. But it's rare. It does happen, of course, but it's very rare indeed. Yeah. And as far as like people asking for more comp or a better role, or people not advocating for themselves, some of that's of course on the person. It could be even it could also be that the team itself knows that person's valuable, but HR has some policy like, hey, we only allow, small promotions or small amounts of pay raises for internal people, whereas external, we'll give them 30-40% more and a title and better hours and stuff. But yeah, it does happen. I've also seen a lot of people like be like, hey, can I have a raise? Someone's like, no. Okay, I'm leaving. And then...
Like, well, actually...
and then they've been offered. And then usually people don't accept the offer. But what people often do is they boomerang. So a lot of big tech companies, I'm not saying which ones, but you can probably guess which ones, people leave a company with the intent to come back at a higher level. Because the promotion process is so complicated and so difficult, and you have less leverage off in the promotion process than if you leave and come back.
Yeah, which is like a really sad and stupid thing in some sense.
But it's real.
Oh, it's very real. Well, there's also like bad will accumulated. Essentially, if you're like, hey, I would like a raise. And they're like, no, well, I have this other offer and I'd like you to match it. And if and then they're like, well, oh, we'll actually pay you now. Like that looks bad. Like I have ill will towards the company because like, why didn't you give me that before? Is it just the threat of leaving that is
like, why do I have to go out and interview to tell you this is my worth, or this is even some fraction of the worth? Sometimes people actually don't want them to match an offer. They're like, hey, this is off by 40%. I make 40% somewhere else, but hey, can you give me like a 5% raise, 10% raise? And they're like, no, we only do 3% raises at our company. And you're like, okay, like, bye.
Yeah. Well, you know, something I've also realized is like, there's always someone above HR, and you know, being like creating enough influence to have that person make the call is very, very powerful. Because, you know, like you're saying, like, it's like, oh, policy is we only do 3%. There's like a policy, so there's equitability within the organization, but there also isn't equitability between who creates value within an organization. And I think that it's good to have policy, but it's also important to have exceptions, because there are inevitably exceptions, and you don't want to lose an unbelievably valuable like exception, right? Like the people who are creating the most value are exceptions in and of themselves. And you shouldn't lose someone like that because you're not willing to make an exception or like an exceptional case in the policies that you've created. And maybe at scale, if you have 100,000 person company, you don't really lose that much because there, in theory, might be multiple of those people. But especially in small organizations, you know, you're probably not going to be around too long if you're not able to retain the people that are. And
the actual domain knowledge and the knowledge of the company leaves with you in a lot of cases. People don't document things because a lot of people aren't paid to document, or they're paid to document, but their actual like OKRs or their promotion cycles are all based on other things.
Yeah. That's an important thing is, you know, what are you paid based on? You know, what, you know, you're getting paid based on like the number of lines of code you write. That might be a flawed metric, right? Or you know, I hopefully, and unfortunately, I don't think too many companies do that. But the entire incentive structure that you build as an organization is something that you really have to think a lot about on. I mean, like peer review, I think is good. But then again, if you're in a system where, you know, like only one person can get promoted into a new role, or, you know, maybe the culture isn't that good and people don't like each other, even though they're doing good work, like that might not be good. And there's a whole, I'm fortunate that I'm grateful that I'm not in HR, because those are not problems I would like to deal with. No, not at all.
But these are also things that we, circling back to like the beginning of our talk, is this are things that people don't realize when they choose a career in a company, is a lot of jobs are actually just stuff like this. Yeah. Like someone's jealous, or someone gets paid more, or someone is unfairly paid less, or it's a big problem. And you see it in big companies, and bigger companies typically have a lot more politics around this stuff.
Yeah. And that's something that I personally, like, I struggle with so much. Like, I don't like playing company politics. I think that, like, the games are stupid. Like, you know, oh, I have to make friends with this person to get this data, and I have to do this and go to this meeting and like be presentable in front of these people and go get drinks so that they know who I am and do whatever. Like, I could not be any less interested in that. But depending on the organizations you're working at, like it can be a super valuable skill. Like I had a friend, and he was maybe one of the best I've ever seen at that. And he got promoted so quickly, made so much money, got equity in one of the companies I was working at. And I was like, yeah, I mean, that's 100% one way to do it. If he loves doing that, like corporate America is a really good place for him.
Yeah.
You know, I sort of maybe like arrogantly believed that, not that I was, I believed it was beneath me.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I'm here to make an impact at your organization. I'm here to do my best work. Like, let me do that. Like, don't get in my way. Don't make me have to do all this overhead and jump through all these loops just to feel like I'm doing something. Like, if you really look at it, that's all wasted energy that I could have been putting into my work.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess that's why I'm more drawn towards like entrepreneurship, or like, small business where I'm running most of my stuff because I can put all the energy that I would feel like I'd waste on those things into what I'm currently doing.
To be fair, you probably have some admin work too, though.
I do.
And I'm sure the admin work is building.
Yes, but I pay an accountant, I pay a lawyer, I have a virtual assistant, and so like in some sense I can outsource those, and it's not like there's any politics with those people. They're like direct contractors that I pay, which is also very nice. Once you scale, though, obviously there are things that come into play. Fortunately, I feel like there's a certain threshold where that becomes an issue. And there's some pretty good research on this around Dunbar's number, which is around 150 people. So if you're in an organization and the number of people gets over that 150, 200 mark, the incentive structure starts to change. So it starts to go from, okay, we're all in this shared journey towards a specific goal, to then people start thinking about how they can individually improve their position or their ranking. So they go from this like shared group cohort towards a shared value driven system to, okay, how do I get the most and exploit this system? How do I get the most for me? How do I get promoted? How do I do these types of things? And I think culturally that shift is something that I've just tried to avoid, by working at smaller companies or by working more for myself. I mean, my company that I work at now is like 6 people. So it's not like we're all shared towards the same vision, like essentially like if our company does well, we all do better. There's no like, oh, I need to be here to do this because like any disruption that we would have, any like drama or conflict would take away and detract from like the contracts that we win and the work that we do and all these other stuff. So it hurts all of us equally. And I find that to be super important when you're especially when you're thinking about work and thinking about organizations. I will say some large companies can create smaller teams and create these little ecosystems that still leverage the small number stuff, but it's difficult. They
try. I think the other big thing is like in some startups, some people have a lot more equity than other people. So someone's like, hey, why aren't you working at, Sunday at 4:00 in the morning? We have this, major deadline or whatever. And it's like, well, you have X% equity and I have 100th of that or something, a lot smaller even. And so for bigger companies, most of the time where you get money is, you might get promotion and raises, but you don't get like a massive chunk of the company necessarily. Yeah.
You get like some shares that might just completely tank on the open market.
If your boss has 100x or even more, it's very different dynamics. So.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm a huge proponent of ownership. I think that any ownership in an organization completely transforms your relationship to it. Like the things that I fully own, I'm so much more accountable to. The things that I feel like I'm not invested in personally. And this is something I do with almost every sponsor I have, is even though they sponsor me, I take like some percent, 5-10% of that money, and I invest it, if they're a public company, into the company. Some have done well, some have not done that great, but I feel like that's like some weird way of me like being a part of it and trying, a YouTube ad for a company is not going to change the bottom line of the company enough to change the stock price, but I feel personally
invested.
Exactly. I'm like more into putting my best work for their company forward.
Yeah, that's one thing about a lot of just pure salary jobs, or like where the stock is very, very little. People want to do more of the 9 to 5 because as far as their time investment, whatever your salary is, or your base pay divided by 40 hours a week is what you get paid normally, assuming you're not working longer hours. So if the job wants you to work 60, well, you're effectively getting paid less because you're working more hours at a lower cost essentially.
Yeah.
So that's why having some ownership stake is good, because your vested vision, like, oh, you want me to do that? Of course, I have, X percentage in this.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting, the style of like options that you get in a lot of these tech companies, whether it's shares, whether it's actually options on the stock. Yeah. The incentive system around that is fascinating, right? So you get the stock, when do you sell, right? The individual person, like, you assume it's going to go up, but it might not. I mean, there's like a whole nother layer of risk associated with getting stock in something. And I personally wonder, I don't actually know the answer. Like, how does that change the like level of work you put in, right? If you know a stock could go down, if you know all this stuff, like how does that change your working behavior? How does that change your behavior around if you'll quit or if you'll sell or if you stay till it vests? Like if the stock's tanking, is it worth staying until it actually vests? You know, if it's going from $100 a share to $25 a share, you know, that system, I guess you're paying your employees. Well, I guess you're not, like, you're paying them the same amount in terms of equity, but it's, there's like a massive can of worms, a massive dynamic there that I would love to analyze in some way.
And that's why people have refreshers and like a lot of complicated stuff just to kind of either incentivize employees to do more, or if the stock's tanking and they don't want to do like layoffs or severance, they just, you know, give the same amount of shares and it's worth a lot less, and they just hope people leave on their own, which is interesting because sometimes the employees that you want to keep are the ones that have the most flexibility as far as next jobs and next options. But it's a very interesting kind of subject. Yeah.
I like am fascinated by the people who have created this infrastructure. It's so complex at some organizations, just the like the bonus structure on top of the option structure, you know, like, you know, so for example, you know, I had a couple data engineers on here, and basically, you know, they're getting 100% bonus if they exceed expectation, 100% bonus on their salary, basically. And it's like, you know, it is, I mean, this is at a relatively high level, but just the amount of tiers, and like, you know, if they were 2 levels down, it would be 40% bonus on their salary or whatever it is. And it's like, I don't know how these organizations keep up with all these things. Like, that would drive me freaking insane. But maybe the answer is you just fire all your employees, and then it cleans up the payment system. That was their secret plot.
And that leads to politics. If a lot of your incentive is based on bonus, and some of that is not exactly quantifiable necessarily, people are going to play a lot of politics, because the game is not necessarily value to the company, it's value to yourself, because that's what they incentivized.
Yeah. So it's definitely a scary thing. I mean, quantifying work output and outcomes is
hard.
Yeah, so hard. I mean, it's like a lot of, you know, a lot of hopefully good data science goes to that, but I don't think that one's anywhere close to solvable on that front. Michael, those are all the questions I had. Do you have anything you're working on, anything you want to share about? The floor is all yours.
So as far as things I'm working on, it changes so much from day to day because I do so many different things. But you can follow me on Medium. I have a blog there that's pretty well subscribed. I have a YouTube channel, which I post occasionally, which I'm not really sure I should mention, but you can find it, Michael Galarnyk, on Medium, YouTube, LinkedIn occasionally. I work for Parallel Domain right now, and I release a couple of blogs about synthetic data. So there's one at Katie Nuggets I'm happy to share, like use cases of synthetic data. I'm releasing a blog eventually about best practices with synthetic data, because it's not really a thing that's very commonly talked about. How do you train a model with synthetic data as well as real data if you want to do that? Like, what are the cases for one versus the other? And so, yeah, that's it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I will put all of the links that Michael just mentioned in the description and in the podcast notes on all the main podcasting platforms. Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.